Welcome to this lesson of the Polgar Chess University. Today, I'll tell you about weak squares and how that knight belongs on outposts. Also, I'll talk about how the king's activity is so important in endgames. And of course, we cannot have a lesson without something really beautiful at the end. I bet you can't wait to see it already. In the meantime, let's start with something very basic. Example of what weak squares are. Here is an example. When black is ahead in exchange and yet is in a lost position due to the fact that the light squares around the black king are really weak. I'm sure you'll notice that after queen c6, black's position is resignable. But let's talk about more positional positions and how to take advantage of weak squares in a strategical position rather than when there is an immediate tactic to decide the game. As we know, weak squares are squares that you cannot protect or attack with a pawn. On the other hand, your opponent can and does. In this case, it's quite obvious to the experienced eye that the d6 square is a weakness in black's position. And white's goal should be to get his knight to that square. This game is a classical game between former world champion Mikhail Botvinnik and Salo Floor from the big tournament in Moscow in 1936. The first move in this position is quite important. That is, white played c5. With this move, white puts a second pawn controlling that crucial d6 square. Black responded with a5. You may wonder why. He did because in addition to fighting for the d6 square, white also had in mind pushing his b pawn up, gaining more space, and trying to create a pass pawn on the queen side. Therefore, black played a5, preventing that advancement of the white b pawn. And now we know what our goal is, that is to get the knight to d6. So we just need to pick a route how to get the knight there. We need to be careful along the way, making sure that the black bishop will not be able to trade for our knight. The next move, at first, may look unnatural, but in reality, it's the quickest way to get to our target square. Considering that other squares such as b5 or e4 were in black's control and the white knight could not go through that way. Black played queen f8 and the white knight appeared on a3. Now we can clearly see what white wants to do, go to c4 and then to d6. It would have been clearly inferior going to d2 because that would allow black to trade off his bishop for the knight. This position is pretty much a closed position with no open files, therefore knights are favorable to the bishop. So white continued with knight a3. Black went back to d8 with the bishop and knight c4. At least the bishop is handy on d8, protecting the pawn on a5. Black played bishop to c7 and the white knight arrived to its dream square on d6. In such position, if the black bishop decides to trade for the knight, that would give white the opportunity to create a protected passed pawn. White could recapture with either pawn with a clearly better position for white. Black instead moved the rook out of danger's way to protect also the pawn on b7. And now, the next plan is to open the b file, trying to trade the b3 pawn for the a5 pawn, and then put further pressure on the pawn on b7. Black played queen d8, and white was ready to play b4. Pawn captures, and rook captures. Now, the attack on the b7 pawn is obvious, and the pawn cannot easily move away either because it's busy protecting the pawn on c6 at the same time. To avoid immediate loss of material, Black finally traded the bishop for the knight, and the pawn captured back. Now the b7 pawn is relatively safe because both black rooks are protecting it, and of course the queen has an option to do that as well, but there is a new target in addition to the b7 pawn, the one on e6, that's now on a half open file. For now, black played queen a5, attacking white's rook. So if the rook moves away on the b file, the a4 pawn would be hanging. But of course, white doesn't have to do that. White can simply double up the rooks along the b file. Black played rook e8, when in reality white could have taken the pawn on b7 with a clear advantage, but Botvinnik played queen e2, not even allowing any shadow of counterplay with a check on d2 with the queen or advancement of the e-pawn. He just wants to prevent any counterplay. Came queen a8, and now swinging the rook over to attack the second weakness on e6. Came king f7. And here, white made in the game an inaccuracy. Always it's very important to remember the tactical opportunities, not only our own, but also of our opponents. It was a bit more precise to move the king out of that long diagonal where black's queen is as well. Botvinnik in the game played queen c4, forgetting about the opportunity of b5. And now black at least got rid of one of the weaknesses, the b-pawn. Of course, it would be a losing blunder to capture the pawn because black recaptures with a discovered check. White moved the queen back to c2. And now black tried to use the same trick a second time by making a rook sacrifice, and then the discovered check with c5. Luckily for white, their position was good enough that they could afford even a mistake and still have a winning position. And white had a completely winning game that he won in several more moves. And here is this famous game by Alekhine versus Thomas from the Baden-Baden 1925 tournament. In this position, it's quite clear that the light squares c4 and d5 are very weak from white's perspective and are great targets for black. The reason being that when black puts a rook or a queen or even potentially eventually a king on one of those squares, it's pretty much impossible to chase the black pieces out of there. Let's see how Alekhine improved his position little by little. He played queen b5, attacking white's bishop, and White protected it. And came rook d5. White played h3, making sure there will not be a back rank checkmate. And black played e6, making sure that d5 square is well blocked and white won't have even dreams to push this d4 pawn up to d5. Came rook e1 and queen a4. Now, in addition to the weak squares that white has on c4 and d5, of course, the other problem is the weakness of the a2 and c3 pawns. With his last move, black has just attacked white's pawn on a2, so the white rook pretty much had to go to defend it. And black played b5. As we see, black one by one puts their pawns on light squares, the opposite color than white's bishop. Also, with this last move, black makes sure to have a long-term control of that crucial c4 square. One of the problems in this position for white is that they have absolutely no counterplay. Black can improve his position little by little with all the time in the world on their hand. White played queen d1 and black played rook c4. It's quite beautiful how the two rooks are blocking those pawns, making sure they don't go anywhere. Black does not mind the exchange of the queens. White played queen b3, dreaming that black would take and connect the isolated a2 pawn with the c and d pawns. Of course, black will not do that favor to white because there is no reason, there is no threat of white why black should do that. Black can just continue improving his position. Came rook d6 and white made a waiting move, lack of anything better to do, and rook a6. Came rook f1 and bishop e7, king h1, rook c4 to c6, rook fe1, bishop h4. And now this is a tricky moment, as so often tactics play a role in strategy. If now the white rook would go to e2, then black all of a sudden would trade because of a tactical opportunity, trade rooks as well, and play rook a6. Now the rook cannot protect the bishop. Bishop must move to b2, and then black is ready to pin the bishop by rook a2. And now, if white brings the king, then a5 comes immediately and advancing the pawn. Or if white wants to prevent that, then bishop g3 simply traps the pawn, and the pawn is undefendable. What a nice little tactic. Therefore, white had no choice but remain on the first rank with the rook. And now came queen c4. What is black's plan? It is to double up the rooks along the a file and put more pressure on the a2 pawn, with moving the rook to a4, followed by the other rook going to a6. Finally, white decided to trade, and now, of course, we take back with the rook and not the pawn, making sure the rook or the rooks can still target the c3 pawn on the half-open file. White played a3, so at least the rook maybe can move away. But black immediately puts more pressure on that pawn, making sure the rook will stay where it is. Came rook b1, bishop to d6, g3. And it's time to bring the king. We're in an endgame. In the opening and the middle game, we want to make sure our king is hidden, usually towards the corner in the castling position, but when the queens are gone, it's time to get the king to action. Endgame, king d7, king e2, king c6. White is pretty helpless. And the third attacker on the a3 pawn. Poor white is purely on the defensive. Very sad. Make sure you try to avoid such a situation if you're white. And learn how to take advantage of all the good things in black's position if you get something similar. King d5. Now, if white is not careful, the black king will simply walk in and be a forced attacker on that pawn on a3. In the meantime, of course, white can prevent that by playing king d3, which he did. Black played rook a5, bishop c1, and a6. Bishop b2. White cannot do anything but hang on as to the dear life of that a3 pawn. Came h5 with the idea to push h4 and trade the h-pawn for the f4 pawn. White played h4, f6. If the white king moves, then the black king could walk in. So the bishop made another waiting move back to c1. And now e5, action time. Attacking the pawn on d4. Therefore white traded. Now white's problem is if they trade on e5 a second time, bishop takes back, and the pawn on g3 is getting into trouble. White played bishop b2, defending the pawn on d4. Pawn takes, and now, typical for pin situations, b4. Pawn takes, rook takes, pawn took the rook, and white lost the bishop. A very nice example of how to use the advantage of the outposts of the weak squares. And now let's see another famous game, or rather the end of it, played by yet another ex-world champion, this time Vasily Smyslov. This position was reached between Lilienthal and Smyslov in 1941. At the moment, white is up one pawn and is attacking another one on g7. The correct way of playing here is not trying to hang on to all the pawns, but rather to create activity. And Smyslov did it beautifully. He played g5, giving up on his pawn on h7, captured the one on a2, of course not the one on e3, because we want to make sure the black rook on a2 is keeping the white king away from activity, making sure it stays right on the first rank. Check, and this is the key moment why I'm showing this endgame. It's more important to activate the king and move forward than moving backwards and protect that pawn on c6. So black sacrificed yet another pawn on c6 and one more pawn. So now white is up 3 pawns and black cannot capture back the one on e3 because then they would lose the one on f5. But here, even in an endgame with so few pieces left on the board, black is able to create an attack, where even white needs to be a bit careful not to lose the game. f4, another pawn sacrifice, and now the black king is able to hide behind the white pawns and create a checkmate threat on the back rank. And it is white who has to look for ways to escape out of the checkmate, and the easiest way to do that is playing h3, and the game actually ended after check because now black can force perpetual checks. Just on a cute note, instead of h3, after h4, white could not escape on h3 because they would even get checkmated. But the real moral of the story in this endgame is that in rook endgames, oftentimes look out for activity rather than passively hanging onto a pawn. And finally, the beauty of the day. Here is the position which was composed by Kujot, and in this position it seems that white's position is quite sad, being a knight and 3 pawns down in material. What to do? Well, try to figure out this miracle on the chessboard. And here is the solution, which is quite brilliant. The first move is quite natural, giving a check, moving our knight out of danger. But so what? The king just moves to b6. And now here white combines several themes. The next move is knight to a8 check. Well, if the king moves out, it's quite simple. White can just repeat moves by moving back and forth with the knight. But what happens if after the check on a8, the black queen captures that knight? Now we're down 2 knights and 3 pawns. Oh my, that's 9 points. How can we save the game here? Finding one more beautiful move. And that is queen b8, trapping black's queen in the corner. And if it doesn't want to be trapped and captures the white queen, stalemate. Wow, quite amazing. Well, I hope you enjoyed this lesson and be back next week. So long until then.